They thought it was crazy to put sandbags on the roof until the extreme heat arrived. The day Martha climbed that ladder for the last time, the whole neighborhood stopped what they were doing to watch. It wasn't discretion that was lacking on her street. It was the kind of place where everyone knew the name of their neighbor's dog and had an opinion about the garden next door at least once in their lives. And when a 71-year-old woman starts tying sandbags to the roof of her own house, you can be sure. The gossip starts before lunch and doesn't end before dinner. Mrs. Beatrice, who lived on the other side of the wooden fence, shaded her eyes from the sun and stared for a good long while. Then she called her husband. The husband called their son. The son took a photo. Word spread quickly through the small rural town. Not that it was front-page news, but it was one of those stories you tell at the corner store while waiting in line. You know Mrs. Martha, the one who lives in the log cabin at the end of Cobblestone Road? Well, yeah, she's putting sandbags on her roof. No, I'm not joking. Real sandbags. Those beige ones, from construction sites. She's tying them herself with her own hands, from the top of a wooden ladder that looks like it's going to split in two at any moment. And the reaction was always the same. A silence, then a laugh, then, "That's crazy." Did Martha hear all of this? Absolutely. But she didn't stop. She climbed the ladder carefully, planted her feet firmly on each rung, held on tight with her black wool glove to the wooden rail, and went up, bag by bag, row by row. With that way of hers of doing things that annoyed half the town, precisely because it seemed too calm for a situation everyone else considered absurd. What no one knew yet was what she knew, and what she knew was going to change everything. Martha had arrived in that small rural town almost 40 years ago, following her husband, Arthur, who had inherited a piece of land from his family. The log cabin was already there, old and good at the same time, that combination only old structures can pull off. They renovated what needed it, reinforced the walls, replaced part of the flooring. But the roof had been Arthur's project from the start. He had grown up in a region of extreme temperatures, where in winter the ice weighed down on everything, and in summer the sun heated the ceiling until the inside of the house became unbearable. His father had taught him, sand doesn't let the heat in. Sand doesn't let the cold out. Sand is insulation. Sand keeps the weather outside. Arthur had explained this to Martha on a Sunday afternoon, sitting on the porch, looking at the rust-colored sky that sometimes painted the sunset around those parts. "You'll see," he had said, with that smile of someone who was certain without needing to prove it. "When the real big heat comes, this house is going to be the coolest on the block." Martha had believed him, not because she was naive, but because she knew Arthur. And Arthur didn't promise what he couldn't deliver, so when Arthur passed away 10 years ago, taken by a heart condition that gave no warning, Martha was left with the house, the memories, and the sandbags. And every time one needed to be repositioned or replaced, she did it. She never let them run out. It was almost a ritual, a way of continuing the conversation that had started that Sunday afternoon. The problem is, nobody knew any of this. And those who don't know the story think they're watching madness. Martha's daughter, Susan, found out about the commotion through her phone, of course. She received messages from 3 different friends before noon. Susan lived in Chicago a few hours away and had built a life she would describe as organized. Everything in its place. Everything as expected. And her mother, with sandbags on the roof, didn't fit into any of those categories. She called that very day. "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm great," said Martha. "Why do you ask?" "Because someone sent me a photo of you on a ladder, on the roof." "I wasn't on the roof. I was on the ladder." "Mom, Susan." There was a pause that the two of them knew well. The pause that meant neither one was going to give in easily, but that one of them was going to have to take a deep breath before continuing. "You don't have to do this. I can hire someone to do what? To put up the sandbags I've been putting up myself for 40 years. No need, dear." "People are talking." Martha was quiet for a second. Then she said, with a calm that came from her like spring water, effortlessly, "They always have." Susan hung up without managing to argue. But she was left with that feeling that anyone who has ever argued with someone older and firmer knows, the feeling of having lost without quite understanding how. What she didn't know was that that phone call was only the beginning, that what came next would put much more than sandbags at stake. Around that same time, the coordinator of the Homeowners Association, a man named Gerald, who was in his 50s and had the habit of speaking loudly at meetings as if volume were synonymous with reason, started circulating the idea that the sandbags were an aesthetic problem for the street, that they devalued the whole, that there was a standard to maintain. He wasn't Martha's direct neighbor, but he was the type who could always find something to manage. There was a residents' meeting. Martha went. She sat in the front row. She listened to everything. When her turn came to speak, she simply said that the house was hers, that the roof was hers, and that there was no written rule prohibiting what she was doing. She asked if anyone had any document that said otherwise. Silence. "Well then," she said, and picked up her purse. Gerald turned red but didn't say anything right away. After the meeting, he commented to 3 or 4 people that woman was difficult. And those 3 or 4 people agreed, because it's easier to agree than to think. There was a young man on that street who didn't agree. His name was Caleb. He was 26 years old, and he was Martha's neighbor on the left side. He worked in construction, knew a bit about materials, and when he heard about the sandbags, he was the one who asked genuinely with real curiosity, "What's this for, Mrs. Martha?" she explained. He listened carefully. He grew thoughtful and said, "That makes sense, you know. Sand has thermal mass, it holds temperature." Martha smiled. Not the smile of someone who had been validated, the smile of someone who recognizes someone who still listens before speaking. "Did your father teach you to build like that?" he asked. "My husband. His father had taught him." Caleb nodded slowly. "And when is the heat coming?" Martha raised her eyes to the sky, not with drama, with the manner of someone who has read that book many times. "It's coming. It's already on its way." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The forecast started circulating on local radio stations about 2 weeks later. Heat waves, temperatures not seen in that region in decades, the kind of thing most people hear and think will pass without them feeling it much, because it's hard to imagine a different kind of heat when you're still fine. The first sign came quietly, the way the signs that truly matter usually come. The plants along the edge of the sidewalk started wilting faster than normal. The children came home from school earlier, their faces red. The water from the tap, which always came out cold, started coming out lukewarm. People began closing windows, turning on fans, exchanging half-finished words because even talking was exhausting. And the heat only kept rising. In Martha's log cabin, she opened the living room window at 7 in the morning, before the sun hit it directly, let the early morning air in and then closed everything up. She did this as she had done for 40 years. And the house stayed. Cool wouldn't be the right word. But bearable, yes. Much more bearable than outside. At Mrs. Beatrice's house, on the other side of the fence, the ceiling fan spun non-stop, and she still stood in front of the open refrigerator just to feel a breath of relief. Her husband had bought a second fan. Her son had gone to get ice. Nothing really helped. On the 3rd day of intense heat, Mrs. Beatrice went to the fence. "Mrs. Martha, how's your house?" Martha was on the porch with a glass of water in her hand. Calm. "It's fine. Come in if you want." Mrs. Beatrice went in. She stood in the middle of the living room for about 10 seconds. Then she closed her eyes. "My God," she murmured softly. "It's different in here." "It is," said Martha, without unnecessary pride. "Sit down." Nothing more was needed. The conversation they had that afternoon, sitting in the wooden living room while the heat throbbed outside, was the longest conversation the two had had in all their years of being neighbors. Mrs. Beatrice talked about things she had never told anyone. Martha listened. Then she talked a bit too. Look, I kept thinking about that scene for a long time. 2 women who had been neighbors for years and had never actually sat down to talk like that. It took a hellish heat for that to happen. Sometimes life uses strange paths to bring people together. The news that Martha's house was cool spread down the street with the same speed that the sandbag story had spread. Except this time the tone was different. It wasn't laughter, it was amazement. And amazement mixed with need, because the heat wasn't letting up. Caleb knocked on her door on the 4th day. "Mrs. Martha, my grandmother's feeling sick from this heat. Can I bring her over for a few hours?" "Bring her and the whole family," said Martha. And that's how her house became a gathering place. In the morning one family came, in the afternoon another. The neighbors' kids from the end of the street spent the whole afternoon drawing on the living room floor while the mothers drank cold water and chatted. Martha didn't have much space, but she shared what she had without any fuss. Gerald, the coordinator, took a bit longer. Pride has weight, and his was considerable. But on the 6th day of heat, when the temperature hit a level that left even the toughest exhausted, he showed up at Martha's door with an expression that was a mix of need and discomfort, the look of someone who has to ask for help from someone they've criticized. She opened the door before he could speak. "Come in, Gerald." He went in, stood quietly for a second, looking at the living room where 3 or 4 people were sitting. Then he looked at her. "I came to see if you needed anything." Martha didn't say anything for a moment. Then she pointed to the empty chair near the window. "I need another chair for the living room. A lot of people have been coming. If you want to grab the one in the yard next door." He went to get the chair, came back, sat down and stayed. For almost 2 hours Gerald sat in that living room without talking about street aesthetics, without talking about standards, without talking about anything he had talked about before. He just stayed. And at some point he asked for a glass of water, and Martha brought it, and when she handed it to him he said, "Thank you," in a voice that sounded smaller than normal, as if he had shrunk a bit. It was on the 7th day that Susan arrived. She hadn't told anyone she was coming. She had left home early in the morning, made the hours-long trip, and shown up at the door with a grocery bag and the face of someone who hadn't slept well. Martha opened the door and stood looking at her. "I came to see you," said Susan. "I can see that," said Martha. They stood there for a second like that, facing each other. Then Martha stepped back from the door and let her daughter in. The house felt a little emptier that morning. It was still early. People hadn't arrived yet. Susan put her bag on the kitchen counter, looked at the living room, looked at the ceiling, looked out the window, and then she turned to her mother. "How do you do it, Mom? How do you stay so calm?" Martha gave that little corner of her mouth smile. "Calm how? You're 71 years old, here alone, in all this heat, with this house full of people every day." Susan stopped, took a breath. "And you seem fine, really. It's not forced." "It's not forced," Martha confirmed. Susan sat down in the chair that was still where Gerald had left it. She sat looking at her hands. Then she looked up. "I'm ashamed of having felt ashamed." Martha went to the kitchen to get 2 glasses of water. She came back, set one in front of her daughter, sat down on the other side of the table. "You don't need to be ashamed of having felt it," she said. "Shame is if I had done something wrong. But I didn't." "I know you didn't," Susan said, and her voice broke a little in the middle. "I know, Mom. It's just that sometimes it's hard to explain to people, to... Who needs an explanation?" Susan went quiet. "Who asked you for an explanation, Susan? Your friends, your co-workers? Did they ask about your mother?" "Not like that, but..." "So," said Martha, with the same calm as always, "you were ashamed of something no one even held against you. You do that a lot, my dear." That sentence landed in the silence of the kitchen and stayed there. Susan looked at her mother for a while, and then, slowly, that tightness she'd been carrying in her chest since the very first phone call started to ease. Not all at once, but it eased. There are things we hear from the people we love that take years to understand, and there are things we understand in a second in a simple kitchen with 2 glasses of water on the table. I can't explain why that is. I just know it is. The extreme heat lasted almost 2 weeks. They were long, heavy days that tested everyone's patience. Some people's crops suffered. Some animals needed special care. The fountain in the town square sat empty for a few days, until they fixed the problem with the oldest section of plumbing. But Martha's house kept standing, and it kept receiving people. One day Caleb showed up with the grandfather of a family who lived farther out, an old man of about 80 who could barely walk well. He stayed the whole day. He slept until the afternoon on a mat Caleb had brought. He woke up feeling better, and in the afternoon, while the old man rested, Caleb sat on the porch with Martha and said something she didn't expect. "Mrs. Martha, I want to learn. The right way. You know? Not from a book. The way you learned. Because now I know that what you did here has technical merit. But that's not what impresses me. It's that you never stopped doing it when everyone said it was crazy." Martha turned the glass between her hands. She looked at the horizon. Outside, the sun was still beating down hard, but it was already starting to soften. It was a sign that the end of that cycle of heat was drawing near. "I learned from Arthur," she said. "He used to say there's a difference between knowing something and believing it. A lot of people know a lot of things. Few people truly believe. When you believe, you do it even when others think it's crazy." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "And when it's hard?" "It's always hard," she said. "The question is what you do with the hard." Susan, who was inside the house and had heard part of the conversation through the open window, stood still for a second with the dish towel in her hand. It was her mother's voice, that voice she'd heard her whole life and hadn't always stopped to truly listen to. She folded the towel, looked at the wooden ceiling of the kitchen, and thought she was going to need to come back more often, not to help her mother, but because her mother had things she still needed to learn. In the days that followed, when the heat began to ease and the morning air regained that lightness it used to have, the street slowly went back to normal. People returned to their homes, to their routines, to conversations over the fence and opinions about the neighbor's garden. But something had changed. Mrs. Beatrice started greeting Martha every morning. Not just a wave from a distance, a real conversation, even if brief. She had discovered that Martha liked lemon balm tea and started bringing a handful from the plant she had in the backyard every now and then. Gerald, from the Homeowners Association, never brought up the Sandbags again. At one of the following meetings, when someone mentioned a structural issue with the old houses in the neighborhood, he said, in a voice different from his usual one, "Sometimes older people know things we haven't learned to value yet." And he didn't say anything else on the subject. Caleb started asking Martha questions regularly, not every day, but every now and then he'd knock on her door, sit on the porch, and talk. She liked it, not because she needed company, but because it was good to see a young person interested in what experience has to offer. And Susan started calling more, not to ask for anything, to talk. And in those calls, there was less tense silence and more room to laugh, to remember to share little everyday things. On a Sunday afternoon, when the heat had finally gone away and a fresh wind began to blow for the first time in weeks, Martha went out to the porch with the grey scarf wrapped around her neck. Not that it was cold, it was a habit. The scarf was old, a bit worn at the ends, and she had been wearing it ever since Arthur had left it on the chair one morning, and she had picked it up to use and never given it back because he didn't need it anymore. She looked at the roof. The sandbags were there, firm, beige, and heavy as always, with the marks of time, with the dust of years, with everything they had endured. "You were right," she said softly without needing anyone to hear. And she stayed like that for a while, standing on the porch, watching the sky slowly turn rust-colored, just like on that Sunday afternoon 40 years ago. She wasn't alone. She never really had been. It just took a while for the rest of the world to understand that. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. When Susan arrived for the next visit, 2 weeks later, she brought her youngest daughter along, a 12-year-old girl named Chloe, who didn't know her grandmother well and was a little shy at first. She stayed quiet, walking around the house, looking at the wooden walls, the old furniture, the floorboards that creaked in some spots. Martha didn't force conversation. She let the girl look, until Chloe stopped in front of a photo hanging on the living room wall, An old photo, black and white, faded. White. Two young people in front of a house very much like that one. Who are they? She asked. Martha went over there. She stood beside her granddaughter, looking at the photo with her. It's me. And your grandfather Arthur. Chloe looked at her, looked at the photo, looked at her again. You were young. I was, said Martha with a smile. And that roof there, Chloe pointed. In the old photo, you could see, even with the poor quality, the beginning of the roof with the bags. It's had the bags forever. Forever, Chloe thought for a second. And Grandpa put them there. He put the first ones. I kept going. The girl kept looking at the photo for a while longer. Then she turned to the side and looked at her grandmother, with that way children have of asking things that adults no longer ask, because they think they already know the answer. Why did you keep going, even after everyone kept talking about it? Martha placed her hand on her granddaughter's shoulder, a hand with a black wool glove, calloused, that knew a lot of work and a lot of time. Because when you truly believe in something, you don't abandon it just because others don't understand it yet, she said. Their understanding would come. It always does. It's just a matter of time. Chloe nodded slowly, with that seriousness of someone storing something important somewhere inside herself. Susan, who was in the kitchen and heard that, got a little misty-eyed for a second. Not from sadness, from that kind of thing that squeezes your chest because it's too good, because you feel like something right is happening. She took a deep breath, went back to what she was doing, but with one less weight on her. That night, the three of them had dinner together at the small kitchen table. The dim light of the old ceiling fixture illuminated the center of the table. Chloe talked about school. Susan talked about work. Martha listened to it all, asked a few things, and when it was her turn, she said that Caleb was wanting to put sandbags on the house he was renovating down the way, and had asked for help to better understand how to do it. So I taught him, she said simply. And he listened? Asked Chloe. He listened. He's a good young man, Susan smiled. You have a way with people, Mom. Martha looked at her. I have a way with people who want to listen. Those are the ones who interest me. After dinner, Chloe helped her grandmother put away the dishes. Something that hadn't been asked for, it had been offered. And while they were putting them away, the girl kept looking through the windows at the old log walls, at the solid structure of that house that had withstood decades, winters, a heat that had broken many people. Grandma, she said while drying a glass, is this house going to last much longer? Martha looked at the wall, at the window, at the ceiling. It's going to last a long time, she said. It was built for that. And she was right, the way she always was. End of story. This story stays with us for a reason. It's not just about sandbags, it's not about a roof, it's not about heat. It's about trusting what you know, even when the whole world is on the opposite side telling you that you were wrong. Mrs. Martha didn't need approval to keep going. She just needed to believe. And when the moment came, the truth showed up on its own. Tell us in the comments, have you ever done something that everyone thought was crazy and that later proved to be right? Where are you watching from? I'd love to know. Thank you so much for being here until the end. Don't forget to like and, most importantly, to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.